All right, get ready because today we are diving headfirst into a topic that's everywhere you turn these days.
Yeah.
Social justice. We're going deep, folks,
Yeah.
unpacking articles, research, even a thought-provoking YouTube video we found. It's going to be like a crash course on this whole debate.
What's fascinating is everyone's got an opinion on social justice, right? But when you actually try to pin down what it means, that's where it gets interesting.
Right. Trying to grab smoke.
Yeah.
Our mission today, then, is to give you the breakdown.
Yeah.
What is social justice? Where did this idea even come from? And why is everyone always arguing about it? By the end of this deep dive, you'll have a much better grasp on all the different angles.
A good place to start is, honestly, acknowledging what the Wikipedia article points out right away. There just isn't one single definition of social justice that everyone agrees on.
So, no easy answers. Okay, but there has to be some common thread, right? What's at the heart of all these different takes on social justice?
Think of society like a playing field, right? Social justice is about trying to make that playing field more level, so everyone has a fair chance to get the resources they need, the opportunities to be recognized for what they bring to the table, basically so everyone can truly thrive. It's more than just saying, hey, equal opportunity for all on paper.
It's about actually doing something about the things
Yeah.
that hold people back, right? The systemic stuff. But everyone agrees things need to be fair. It's the how we make that happen where the real debate starts. Wild how sort of basic goal gets so complicated.
And that's why getting a handle on the history of social justice is key. Like, where did this whole idea come from? That helps us understand all those different interpretations we were just talking about.
History lesson time then.
Yeah.
Way back when, where did this all begin?
Believe it or not, you can trace it all the way back to ancient Greece. Thinkers like Plato, in his work Republic, were already trying to wrap their heads around this idea of a just society. Everyone's got their role to play, everyone gets what's due to them. It was all about keeping things harmonious, you know?
Wow, so these conversations have been going on for ages. Wasn't that also around the time the whole idea of a social contract emerged?
Spot on. The idea that we as individuals, we agree to follow certain rules because in exchange, we get to live in a society with its protection and benefits. Socrates is often given credit for laying the groundwork there, and it's been central to political philosophy ever since.
Mind-blowing how these ancient ideas are still relevant. But when did the actual term social justice come into the picture?
So the term itself pops up more and more in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's actually Catholic thinkers like Luigi Tapparelli who really start using the term social justice in the 1840s. He was building on the ideas of Thomas Aquinas centuries earlier.
And wasn't that during some crazy upheaval? Socially, the Industrial Revolution was changing everything, new movements popping up all over.
Absolutely massive changes happening. And thinkers like John Stuart Mill, they were wrestling with what all this meant for social justice. Mill argued that if you're contributing equally to society, you deserve equal treatment. Radical for that time. Social hierarchy was everything back then.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution, for all its progress, it also shone a light on how unequal things really were, and probably made it worse for some.
For sure. And then fast forward to the 20th century, social justice is front and center in political and legal philosophy, especially in the U.S. This is where you see legal scholars like Louis Brandeis challenging the Supreme Court when their decisions blocked social and economic progress.
It's amazing how often the fight for social justice ends up in court. And this is around when global organizations like the International Labor Organization, the ILO, started forming, right?
The ILO is a perfect example. Their whole founding document connects lasting peace to having a foundation of social justice. That tells you how important they think it is globally.
Powerful stuff. The idea that we can't have a peaceful world without a just one. Okay, enough about the past, though. Let's zoom in on the 21st century. What are modern thinkers, organizations, how are they looking at this whole complicated issue of social justice?
Okay, buckle up, because this is where things get really interesting. The Wikipedia article dives into all sorts of different philosophical takes on this, just for the modern age.
Hit me with it. Who are the big names shaping how we think about this today?
All right, well, one of the heavy hitters is John Rawls. Super influential. Rawls argued that a truly just society, it's not just about everyone having the same opportunities in theory, it's about making sure that when there are inequalities, because there always are, right, that those actually benefit the people who are the least advantaged.
So not just leveling the playing field, but making sure any advantages in the system actually help those who need it most.
You got it. That's the heart of Rawls' argument. He wants us to think about justice not just as individual rights, but as this collective responsibility we've got to create a system where everyone has a shot to thrive.
Makes you think about those who are left behind. even in places that think they're doing pretty good on the justice front.
And then you have philosophers like Thomas Pogge. He's taking a more global view. Pogge argues that the way institutions are set up, especially the big global ones, they shouldn't actively harm the world's poor.
So not just avoiding doing bad stuff, but actively trying to prevent harm, especially to the people who are most vulnerable.
Exactly. He's all about being proactive when it comes to global justice.
And speaking of global, we got to talk about the United Nations.
Yeah, the UN is practically synonymous with social justice on that big scale. What's their take?
They see it as completely tied to global peace, and honestly, whether the world thrives or not. The UN argues that making sure resources and opportunities are distributed fairly, compassionately, it's not just some moral thing to do, it's essential if we want a stable world that works.
It really drives home how these things are all connected: social justice, peace, the well-being of the whole planet. Okay, but let's get specific. What are some of the concrete issues that people are saying are crucial for a society to be considered just these days?
All right, well, that's where this article we found, 15 social justice issues we must address, comes in. It's like a snapshot of what people are most concerned about in the world right now. Climate change is a big one, obviously.
Yeah, and that's not just an environmental issue anymore. It's a social justice issue.
Yeah.
Because the people hit hardest by climate change are often those who did the least to cause it.
Exactly. And then there's the refugee crisis. Millions of people forced from their homes because of conflict, persecution, climate disasters. It's ongoing.
The article does not hold back on how dangerous and difficult it is to be a refugee, especially women and children. Talk about a reminder of the human cost when there's no justice. And we can't forget the whole rise of political extremism, right? The article calls that out as a huge threat to social justice.
They specifically mention right-wing extremism getting stronger both here in the US and in Europe. They say how that kind of rhetoric, it always seems to target and scapegoat groups that are already marginalized, and that just tears apart the whole idea of a just and inclusive society.
It's a good reminder that progress isn't guaranteed, and we've got to be active about protecting everyone's rights, especially when those kinds of ideologies gain traction. And speaking of rights, the article also dives into reproductive rights.
Yeah, the overturning of Roe v. Wade here in the U.S. is a prime example of how fast those rights can disappear. And like the article says, this is totally connected to other social justice issues. Gender equality, poverty, LGBTQ plus rights, it's all woven together.
Shows you how one setback can have ripple effects across the whole fight for social justice. It's not just these big headline issues, though. Even something like access to healthcare gets talked about in terms of social justice now, right?
Totally. The idea is that everyone, no matter how much money they make or where they come from, should be able to get quality health care. That's considered a basic part of a just society. We can't forget the role that religion plays in all of this either.
Religion is a powerful force, that's for sure. And it can be a force for good or a roadblock when it comes to social justice. The Wikipedia article goes into that relationship between religion and social justice, and it's actually super interesting to see how different faiths approach this whole idea.
It's definitely a complex issue. We could do a whole deep dive on just that. But let's hit some key takeaways just to give you an idea. Within Christianity, for example, you've got a whole spectrum of views.
So even within one religion, there are tons of different interpretations of what social justice means.
Oh yeah, tons. You have some evangelical Christians who are getting more and more involved in social justice issues these days. Then you have the Methodist Church. They've got a long history of activism in this area. And then there's Catholic social teaching, which is all about the dignity of every single human being and this idea of a preferential option for the poor.
So even within one branch of Christianity, you have a range, right? From just doing individual acts of charity to actually trying to change the system.
Yeah.
What about other faiths?
In Islam, for example, they often connect social justice to how they govern themselves, making it a central part of how society should run. Helping those in need is a major emphasis. In fact, zakat, which is like almsgiving, it's considered the right of the poor in Islam, not just some optional nice thing to do.
And in Judaism, there's this huge emphasis on tikkun olam, which means repairing the world. It's at the core of how they see the world. Encouraging acts of kindness, charity, constantly working towards a more just and harmonious world.
It seems like across different faiths, there are common values, right? Caring for the less fortunate, trying to build a more just world for everyone. But I'm guessing there are also some big differences.
Oh, for sure. The details of how each faith actually acts on those values, how they interpret them, that's where things get different. But to really grasp the why behind a lot of social justice movements around the world, you have to factor in religion,
Mm.
the huge influence.
Adds a whole other layer to this, and it's already complex. Speaking of movements, are there any that really stand out in terms of their impact or how they go about things?
Man, there are so many out there doing incredible work, but a few deserve a shout out. Liberation theology, for example, is a powerful movement started in Latin America, and they're challenging social and economic injustice through a Christian lens.
So they're using their faith as a tool for social change. That's amazing. Exactly. Liberation theology came about because of the intense poverty and oppression in so many Latin American countries. They take Christian teachings and use them to advocate for those who are marginalized, pushing for real systemic change. And then there's this whole global movement for human rights education that's gaining steam.
Right. The idea is that if you teach kids about human rights and social justice from a young age, they'll grow up to create a more equitable world, planting those seeds of empathy and understanding early on.
Precisely. The UN has been a huge supporter of this, trying to get human rights education into schools everywhere. They see it as a long-term investment in a better future. And of course, we can't ignore all the environmental and climate justice movements going on right now.
Those movements are on the front lines, making that connection between social justice and what's happening with the climate. They want solutions to the climate crisis that actually benefit everyone, especially those hit hardest by it all.
Right. They get that the climate fight is totally intertwined with all these other social justice issues. But as much as we could talk about these movements and how they're working towards change, we have to acknowledge that not everyone is on board with this whole social justice thing. In fact, there are some pretty harsh criticisms out there.
It's true. No deep dive is complete without looking at both sides. And that's where the criticism section on Wikipedia comes in, along with that pretty intense YouTube video we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, they offer a really important counterpoint to everything we've discussed so far. We want to present these criticisms fairly, though, without picking sides. We're all about critical thinking here, hearing all the perspectives.
Lay it on me then. What are the biggest arguments against this whole idea of social justice?
One of the most common ones is that this whole concept, social justice, is flawed from the start. Critics say it's just too vague, too politically loaded, that it lacks a clear definition. And they say that any attempt to actually achieve social justice, it always ends up eroding individual freedom and economic freedom.
So, to them, it's like this slippery slope where the government gets too much power and people lose their individual rights.
Exactly. The economist Friedrich Hayek, for example, was really against social justice. He said it's meaningless and that it just weakens the principles of a free society.
So they see it as this fundamental clash. Social justice versus individual freedom. What other problems do they have with it?
Well, some argue that even if the goal of social justice is good, how people go about it can actually be harmful. They point to cancel culture as an example.
Oh yeah, cancel culture, that's everywhere you turn these days. But what does it mean in this context when we're talking about this critique?
Well, the argument is that cancel culture, this thing where people get publicly shamed and shut out for saying or doing something considered offensive, often without any real chance to explain themselves, that it creates this climate of fear where people are afraid to speak their minds,
Yeah.
and that it actually undermines the principles of a just society.
It's like some kind of digital witch hunt, right? Where you're afraid to say what you really think because you don't want to be the next target. And that's a problem for sure. This video we watched, they say this is all part of what they call a suicidal impulse within social justice movements, which is a pretty provocative way to put it.
Their argument is that this constant focus on the negative, on what's wrong, on tearing down existing power structures without offering any real alternatives, they say it's leading these societies towards self-destruction.
That's a bleak way to look at it, but I see what they mean about the possibility of good intentions backfiring. The video makes some good points about how effective these movements really are. Are they actually making a difference?
That's the question we should all be asking. And the video gives examples like defund the police. Whether you agree with that or not, it's a policy that was supposed to be about positive change, but it had unintended consequences, right? Some communities actually became less safe. Things got more unstable.
Shows you it's not just about good ideas, it's about thinking through all the what-ifs, even the bad ones.
Exactly. We can't tear things down without having a better plan ready to go.
So we've got all this potential good that can come from social justice movements, but then there's these criticisms about how they actually play out. Is there a middle ground somewhere? Can we address the injustices without resorting to tactics that cause harm or make things worse?
That is the question. And it's not an easy one to answer. The video we watched seems to think we're on a collision course, like there's no easy way out. But not everyone who supports social justice is on board with these extreme tactics the video shows. That's important to remember.
Right. It's easy to focus on the loudest voices, but there are plenty of people who want social justice, who are also reasonable, willing to listen, and ready to have a respectful conversation about all of this.
And that's what gives me hope, honestly. It's the people who are willing to try to understand each other even when they disagree and work towards finding solutions that address the real problems in the world. But they're doing it without turning to demonization or trying to make everyone think the same way.
So we spent a lot of time on what social justice is. But what I want to know is, what does it actually do? We heard from the critics, and that YouTube video had some pretty wild claims. How do we balance those criticisms with the idea that social justice movements can be a good thing?
Yeah, that's where it gets kind of complicated, right?
Yeah.
The video argued that some of these movements are actually making things worse, not better. Like, they're so focused on dismantling Western traditions and institutions that they're actually undermining the very idea of a just society.
It's like, okay, you tore down the old system, but now what? They also spent a lot of time on the whole free speech thing. That argument about cancel culture was pretty intense.
Yeah, you can't ignore the impact cancel culture is having. People are facing huge consequences for things they say or do, often without even getting a chance to explain themselves or make things right. It's not about having an open conversation. It's about publicly shaming people and making them afraid to disagree.
It's like this weird thing where everyone's walking on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing and get jumped on. And the video called that part of the suicidal impulse within social justice movements. Right. Pretty strong words.
They're basically saying that this focus on the negative, on what's wrong, on tearing everything down without offering any real solutions, that it's ultimately going to lead to the downfall of the very societies they're trying to improve.
It's kind of a dark way to look at it. But I get what they're saying about unintended consequences, even when your intentions are good. They raise some good questions about whether these movements are actually being effective.
Right. Are they actually making a difference? That's something we need to ask ourselves. And they brought up examples like defund the police. Now, again, whether you agree to that idea or not, it was supposed to be a positive change, but it actually backfired in some places, right? Some communities ended up less safe, more unstable.
It's not enough to just have a good idea on paper. You have to think about how it's actually going to play out in the real world. Consider the downsides, too.
Exactly. And it shows that we need to be smart about this. Find solutions that are both just and effective. You can't just tear things down without having something better ready to take its place.
So we've got this tension between the good that social justice movements could do and the concerns that people are raising about how they're going about it. Where's the middle ground? Can we fight injustice without resorting to tactics that are harmful or counterproductive?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this video made it seem like we're on a crash course, that there's no easy way out. But it's important to remember that not everyone who believes in social justice agrees with those extreme tactics.
So true. It's easy to get caught up in the loudest voices, but there are tons of people who want a more just world who are also, like, reasonable. They're willing to listen and have a real conversation about this stuff.
And that's what gives me hope. It's the people who are willing to try to see things from each other's perspective, even when they disagree. People who want to find solutions to real problems, but they're not trying to demonize anyone or force everyone to think the same way.
We've really dug into this whole social justice thing, haven't we? All the different ways people see it, the history behind it, even those really harsh criticisms.
And it doesn't seem like the conversation's going to end anytime soon. That YouTube video we talked about, they actually said that in a few years, social justice might be a thing of the past.
Whoa. Really? That's a pretty bold prediction. Like, there's going to be some kind of backlash. But what would that even look like?
They threw out a few ideas. One was we might see right-wing populism make a comeback, like a total rejection of everything the social justice movement stands for. Or it could be more subtle, like people just getting fed up with how some of these advocates are acting and tuning it all out.
Yeah, I could see that. If you feel like you can't even talk about this stuff without getting labeled as, like, the enemy or whatever, you're just going to check out.
That's the danger, right?
Yeah.
Then these important conversations about fairness and equality and making sure the most vulnerable are taken care of, those conversations just stop happening.
That's like the very things they're fighting for could get lost in all the noise.
The video even said that the backlash might end up looking a lot like the things social justice movements are trying to fight against.
Wait, so they're saying we could see more prejudice, more inequality, all because of this?
That was their point, yeah. If social justice keeps focusing on demonizing entire groups of people, like, say, white men, it's just going to create more resentment and make those prejudices even worse. This kind of vicious cycle.
That's a scary thought. One kind of injustice leading to another. Do you really think that could happen, though?
It's definitely something to think about, especially with how heated this whole debate has gotten. But we have to remember, not everyone who supports social justice is like those extreme examples in the video.
Right. The loudest voices aren't always the only voices. There are plenty of people who care about social justice who are also, like, thoughtful. They want to have real conversations, not just shout at each other.
And that's where I think the hope lies, honestly. Finding ways to have these conversations, even when they're tough, without turning it into some kind of war.
It's about finding common ground, even when you disagree about the details. Realizing that, in the end, we're all in this together. We're all trying to build a better world.
The video made a good point about that. They said the future of social justice isn't set in stone. It's up to us to decide what it's going to look like.
What we're going to choose. Division and hate.
Yeah.
We're actually trying to understand each other.
Big questions, right. But those are the stakes. It really comes down to what each of us decides to do. How we treat each other, how we engage in these conversations. That's what's going to determine the future.
It's not about easy answers, that's for sure. But I think that's a good place to leave it for today, with something to think about.